Hey everyone, it's Greg again. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at data curation, specifically the ability that Hub Central enables you to map your data from all the different sources that it comes to us in whatever schema those original sources were represented as, to a common entity model that we have defined. And we'll see how we can use out-of-the-box transformation functions that are available to us in order to mold that data into the exact shape that we desire for the data services that we need to provide our customer to best be able to consume that data. So let's take a look at the mapping concept. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get logged into Hub Central. And once you're in Hub Central, let's click on Curate. And here we can see that our customer entity that we created in our model step is present. And if we expand that customer entity, we can start to define mapping, matching, merging, or custom steps that will allow us to process data and model it towards that customer entity. And so the very first thing we're going to do is map the data, taking it from its original shape and transforming and mapping it to the customer entity model that we've created. So under the mapping, let's click Add New. And we're going to give this new step a name. And we're going to call it Map Home. And the purpose of this step is to map the home insurance data to our customer entity model. So we might describe it as such. Next, we need to define what data this step should process. And we can do that by defining the source query. A real simple way to constrain which data this step will process is to take advantage of the collections that are tagged on different data sets as you load and manage it in MarkLogic Data Hub. Another very flexible option is a query-based approach, where you can enter any search query that you wish to constrain that data in a meaningful way. So if you only wanted to process customers who had a first name of Sam, you could develop a query to implement that constraint. We, however, want to do this based on collection name. And specifically, we're going to reference the collection called Load Home. And you'll see as we type here, we can select from available collections in our hub. The reason we're choosing the Load Home collection name is because when we loaded data in an earlier step, we named that step that loaded the data for home insurance Load Home. And so by defining that collection here, this mapping step will process all of the source data that we loaded earlier as part of that Load Home step. And that's exactly what we want to do. Let's process all the home insurance data and map it to our customer entity. So let's go ahead and save this step. And once we save it, you can see that a configuration interface automatically pops up, and a sample document from the collection that we are going to process is shown to us over on the left, and our entity model for the customer entity is shown to us on the right. So what we want to do is map and transform from the left to the entity model as appropriate for the business objectives that we're trying to achieve. So let's go ahead and do a really simple example here. Let's take the ID property from the source system data and map it to the ID property in our entity. To do that, we can use the picker icon over here to pick from choices that we have available from that source. And so here we just want to select ID, and that will map it to our entity. Now, it's a good habit to test as you go. So let's test here by clicking the test button, and we can see that the data from our source gets mapped, and we can see that value or result of the mapping right here. Let's continue this pattern using the picker to define all of these various simple property-to-property mappings. Here, our source data has a given name property, and we want to map that to the given name property in our entity. Here, our source has a surname property, and we want to map that to the surname property of our entity. Let's go ahead and pause there and do another test just so we can see the results of this so far. Now, property-to-property mappings are really simple to implement, and you can implement these in an XPath type of an approach. But there's also times where you might wish to transform the data as it's being mapped in some meaningful way. And that's exactly what we're going to have to do here for the birth year property. Note that in the source data, we have the birth date reflected. But we don't want the entire birth date. All we care about is the year component of that date. So, as we map this, we're going to apply a transformation function. And out of the box, the MarkLogic Data Hub gives you access to many different commonly used transformation functions. All you have to do is use the little f of x function picker icon here, and you can select the function that you desire. All of these functions are documented, so if you're unsure of what one of these does, you can easily consult the documentation in order to figure out how to use it. For our purposes here, we want to use a function called year from date. So I'm going to start typing there and watch it filter down through the list. And the function I want is this one here, year from date. We're going to pick that, and we can see that the input to this function is going to be a value in a date form. What specific value? Let's use our picker to choose the value, which happens to be the property called birth date. And so I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. And now you can see I'm passing in the value of the birth date property to this year from date function, and this function will transform it appropriately. Let's go ahead and test again. And we can see that the result of our test, we only get the year coming out of this birth date property, 1977, for this example. So let's continue to work with our data, mapping different properties using functions and simple property-to-property mappings. So for the SSN, let's use the picker, and let's choose the national ID, as that is what the schema from the source data calls this value. And it doesn't matter what the original source value is defined as, we can map it to the entity model that we created, which is a property called SSN complete. And that's valuable because you might have hundreds of sources that represent customer data, and they might all have slightly different variations of how they reflect a key property of data. All you have to do in the MarkLogic Data Hub is set up a mapping step for each of those sources and configure how it should be mapped. And then we'll end up with a canonical representation for these key properties as defined in our entity. For the next property, SSN short, this is an example of where we want to use another transformation function in order to process this data and take just the last 4 digits of that social security number. So let's use the f of x function picker, and the function that we want to use in this example is called substring. So I'm just going to scroll down here until I can find that substring function, and here it is. And we can see that it wants to be provided the string of data to process and the positional information about what data should be kept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it in using the function picker, that national ID, And then I'm going to experiment with the appropriate numbers in order to deliver the data that I want. So starting at position 6 and taking 4 positions from there, let's go ahead and test that and see what we get. And if I test that, I can see I'm getting 8192 as the transformed data. And if I compare that to the source, that is in fact the last 4 digits of that value. So that's looking good. Next, let's configure our structured properties. So billing address itself is really a containing property for our address data. So there's no mapping that we need here. Let's just select slash or key in slash, as that will control and let us go into the child data here beneath it. Then let's do the mappings for the street, city, state, and zip using the picker. So billing street, billing city, billing state, and billing zip. All right, we've done a little bit of work here, so let's go ahead and test that. And looking at the test results, it looks pretty good. Next, let's do the same thing for policies. So for policies, I'm going to enter a slash, and then I'm going to map these types of data. Now, the policy type is actually going to be something that we hard code, because all of the data that this step is going to process is related to home insurance. So for policy type, inside of single quotes, I'm just going to type the string home. And we can see, as the result of our testing, that that will set the value for that property equal to home. And then let's map the policy number. And let's set the policy zip for home insurance to be equal to the zip code of the address that's being insured. And in our source data, that is coming from the insured zip property. So let's save those changes and do one last test to exercise this mapping against the sample. And once you're happy with how that looks, we're now ready to run this step. So we can close out of our mapping configuration interface, and from the Curate pane in Hub Central, if we hover over this map home step that we've created, we can choose whether we want to add this to a new flow or an existing flow. Let's go ahead and add it to that sunrise flow that we created earlier. And when prompted to confirm, let's choose yes. We now have the map home step as part of our sunrise flow, and we're immediately taken to the run pane within Hub Central. So if we wish to at this point, we can actually run that step, process all of those home insurance data set that we loaded earlier, map it according to our configuration, and then see the results. So let's do that. Let's hover over our map home step, and let's click the play button. And once the step completes, you'll see an option pop up that will allow you to explore that curated data. Let's go ahead and click on that, and that will take us over to Data Hub Explorer, where we can then choose how we wish to look at this data. So for example, you can see information here, and you can see that that birth year property is something that we can now use to constrain against this data set. And the reason for that is because when we modeled that customer entity, we set the birth year property to have a facet constraint. And so we can use this slider here to apply different ranges and constrain that appropriately. So here I've changed the range that I wish to look at. I can apply that, and I can see that the results change within there. I can also use the search box to search using various strings and so forth. So if I want to look for customers named Barbara within a particular date range, I can do that. And if I want to take a deeper look at any one of these documents, I can click over here and I could see the result of the mapping to my entity model. Next, let's apply this same concept to the auto insurance data. So I'm going to go back to the Curate pane. I'm going to expand my customer entity, and I'm going to add another step. And this time, the step that I'm going to add is for mapping the auto insurance data. So I'm going to call it Map Auto. And we could describe that, of course. And then we need to again define what data we want this step to process. So in this configuration, we're going to tell it to use the load auto collection because that is the name of the step that we defined earlier to load all of that auto insurance data. So let's save this step and then let's start to configure it. And just like before, we're going to have a mix of property-to-property mappings and transformations that we'll need to do. So let's start from the top, where we'll map the ID property from the source to our entity. And we'll use the property as defined in our source here, and in the auto insurance data, this is modeled in the original source as first name. And we're going to map it to our given name property in our entity. And in the source, the last name is last name, and we're going to map it to surname in our entity. Next, let's think about how we're going to tackle the birth year property. We saw with the home insurance data how we could use a date transformation function that automatically selected the year component of the date. And the reason that that transformation function worked with that example is because the original source system represented the date in an ISO standard date format, which is a 4-digit year, a dash, a 2-digit month, a dash, and a 2-digit day. But in the auto insurance data, the birth date is represented differently. This is not an ISO standard date form. And we have month/day/4-digit year, but depending on the month and depending on the day, those could be 1 or 2-digit values. So we're going to take a different approach with how we transform this data. Let's use the function picker, and we're going to select a function called Tokenize. And with Tokenize, we are going to pass it in the string that we want to analyze, which is the birth date property from the source data. And we're going to tell that tokenization function that we want to look for a certain character, specifically the / character. And it will then break up that string of data into individual tokens wherever it sees that / character. And then we want specifically the third token, which is the year component. So outside of this function in square brackets, let's put the number 3. And that will tell it, give us the third token based on that / analysis. So let's go ahead and test this and see how we did. And when we look at the results of that test, we can see that yes, we are in fact getting the year out of that data. All right, so let's continue here. Mapping the complete SSN to the SSN property that we see here. And then again, we're going to use the f of x to substring function to analyze that full SSN. And then we're going to tell it that based on the reference of that data, which if you notice looking at the source, the SSN property has dash characters in there. So instead of starting at character 6 like we did in the last example, we're actually going to have to start at character 8. So 8, 4. And like always, let's test that out and see how we're looking. 8637, 8637, looking good. Now let's do the address. And just like before, we'll put a leading slash in there, and then we'll start to pick the properties for the address, starting with address street, address city, address state, and address zip. Again, just going from source to entity model with our mapping. Lastly, let's set the policy data. So a leading slash goes into the policies property, and then just like before, we'll hard code the policy type as auto. And the policy number we will select here using the picker. And the policy zip we'll also select here using the picker. And because this is auto policy, a car doesn't have a zip code like a home does. So we're going to simply choose the zip code of the address. Let's test all this out. And when you're happy with the results, we will then go ahead and close out of the map auto configuration. And we're going to run this step. So just like before from the Curate pane, let's hover over the map auto step and add it to our sunrise flow. And when prompted to confirm, choose yes. Now the map auto step has been added to our sunrise flow, and we're automatically taken to the run interface. Let's hover over the map auto step and click the play button in order to run it and process all those documents according to our mapping configuration. And when the step completes, let's click on Explore Curated Data. We'll be directed back to Data Hub Explorer, where we can start to work with this information in any way we so desire.